Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for bearing with our technical catch-up up here. To those who are coming into this room for the first time this morning, welcome to the Archaeology of the Predynastic Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom session. It's wonderful to see you all. The weather in the Predynastic is nice, so we're going to hang out here for the second talk of this session by Lamorris and Fort, titled An Examination of Plant and Animal Species on Predynastic Pottery and Other Wares. Take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it, man. You need to come back to work with me, man, so that you could do that for me when I come in every morning. My paper is on an examination of plant and animal species on predynastic pottery and other wares. Okay, there we go. All right. This is a topic that I have a lot of interest in, so I ended up kind of going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, just over the years. And this is just a selected literature review of some of the people's works that I looked at, and it really helped me out because there's not a lot of information about the actual iconography on the pots. As people that study it, you know, they know well. But these are the particular items that we're going to look at today. So I just picked different elements off of each one to highlight. And let's see, we're going to look at these two plant species that I've been able to identify on the pottery. And we're also going to look at these animal species, because there's so much happening on these pots. I had to kind of narrow it down to something that was manageable for 20 minutes. So the first place we're going to start is just with early in the predynastic period, during the phase of the wet Sahara. And when people started to move into this part of Africa, there was a lot of environmental upheaval. So obviously that had some effect on the people and the way that they viewed their place in the world around them. And these Africans were coming from all different types of places, from all different directions, and they were bringing their pottery with them. We see pottery during this time going back to at least the 10th millennium BCE in West Africa, and it seems to make its way towards the Nile. And we actually have a good idea about what caused the drying of what we would call the wet Sahara, and it has a lot to do with Arctic winds coming down and pushing the warm air out. And it caused a flip-flop that ultimately ended in the rainforest in the central and southern part of Africa. So it's kind of a rain cycle that's been happening for a while. So the method, the Tep Hesed that I came up with, is to separate and isolate design elements individually from the depicted scene, then identify the element as best as possible, whether it's something natural or something man-made, place the element back into the scene, and apply the knowledge of the element to the scene it occupies, and then draw a conceptual and contextual conclusion on the scene as a whole based on element attributes. And I used Gunter Dreyer's methodology as the base for what I wanted to do, because I poured over a lot of his work. May he rest in peace. Now, we have the first pot here is depicting a plant or a tree, as in at the Metropolitan Museum. And in this plant, you see these quite a bit. Sometimes they're not always as prominent, but in this one, it's just, especially on this one side, it's huge. It takes up most of the range of the pot, because this pot, as you can see, it's more narrow than it is wide. And the species here is the Aloe africana, or at least some type of hybrid of it, because this plant originates in southern Africa, but it does have hybrids that run along the Nile and into as far as the south central Sudan and in that area of the upper Sahel. And the one thing that we see is, you can see the raceme at the top is bent. They exhibit a very extreme phototropism. So as the sun moves across the sky, it moves. The raceme is usually standing straight up, but it moves. And in the hybrids, that phototropism, that exaggerated phototropism is heightened. And sometimes we see on these pots just the raceme by itself, but it stands straight up. Now on the second pot, we're going to take a look at the plant that's on the front of the solar boat. This one, and we're just going to isolate it from the rest of the scene and the things that are happening. And the structure of it tells us quite a bit. And we can see that what we're actually looking at is a common reed plant. This particular plant is very important to the African ecosystem in general. And during the times of this environmental upheaval where everything's starting to dry out, this plant would have had a significant importance, because one of the things that it does is it doesn't have to be rooted to the ground. It actually can float. And there's large masses of them in the Nile that do float together with other plants, and they float in clumps. This is why you can put them in like water fixtures and things like that really, really easily, and they don't really root. And also, one thing I do want to say about this is that along with this and the Aloe africana, even though you don't have the anthropomorphized figures like you do with the figures to the right, what we're probably looking at here is the earliest attestations we have of Usir, or Osiris as is more commonly known, because he is associated with the reed plants or the reed bundles and just plant life in general. I would say the same thing for the Aloe africana, because the raceme grows straight up from the plant. And on this next jar here, I'm going to deviate from the animals and plants, and we're going to look at these particular symbols. What I did for this is I took, instead of trying to figure out what all of them were together, I isolated the symbol. And I found one good one, and once I found that one, I put it in a photo editing program and I duplicated it. And so I just duplicated it twice, and so I lined them up together. And if you line 3 of them up together and you combine them, you get a short water ripple. And I just did it again and made a long one, right? Because I was looking for patterns, So what we can conclude from that is when you see these pieces of water ripples going downward, you're looking at rain. And when they're going from side to side, you're looking at like a river or a stream. And the thing about it is that you're talking about water that moves on its own naturally, so as opposed to something that moves by way of a canal or an irrigation system or something like that. So culturally, there's a significance when you have an area like the Sahara that's beginning to dry out. And on the next pot, we're going to get into the animals now. So I highlighted this animal. And when you look at animals like this, especially the smaller bovids, one of the tells is you have to look at the horns, because they have different horn configurations. And it varies by species and sometimes by subspecies. But the species that we're looking at here is the addax. They call it the white antelope, but I kind of try to stay away from that term antelope, because when you're trying to be specific, terms like that don't really help you. So with the addax here, you can clearly see the twisting horn formation. This animal is also referred to in several funerary texts, even as early as the pyramid texts. It talks about the white antelope as well. And one of the reasons why contextually this animal may be on this pot is because they tend to dig shallow pits and in the summer and during sandstorms, and they'll lay down in them, and then afterwards when the storm passes, they get up and they shake the dust off of them, which is something that you see reference to. You see it in the coffin text where it talks about standing up and shaking off the dust. So we're going to go to the next one here. Okay, we have these symbols here from the same pot as I got the reed leaf off of. And with stuff like this that's more abstract, I tend to rely on like trying to figure out what the shapes are, because that's really all we have to go on. So This one I actually got lucky with because the figure on the standard to the left gave me a clue. So when we look at it from that perspective of what you have around it, because really that's all you have to draw on. So when you're making when you're doing your study. So here I isolated once again. I just isolated one instead of all of them. There's 14 of them there, and so I started looking at it and I was like, it looks just like a cow's head. And so when you take the basic figure of the curve, the straight line that comes down, and the oblong shape at the middle, you can verify it if you look at an actual live animal. So when I duplicated the shape, that's exactly what I had. And this is a shape that you see actually repeat in other things. And it corresponds, like I said earlier, with the figure on top of the standard, which is pretty much the consensus that it's bot that we're looking at. So when we go to this figure, everybody's seen this figure. It's pretty famous. And with this figure, it goes, this is actually, I went to the Brooklyn Museum and took this picture myself. You always see it from the front, sometimes from the side, from the back, but almost never from the side. So when I went to travel to see this, I noticed that you have a similar pattern here, because we know that this is basically, it's a composite character, which was common in the pre-dynastic periods. And so we see the same shape that we saw on the cow's head and on the other pots. And when we go to this figure, I'm going to highlight these. Most placards in museums and in some of the literature that's written about them, they'll tell you that they're flamingos, but I tend to agree with Dr. Stan Hendricks, for example, when he says that they're ostriches, and we can actually kind of get into that now. When you put them side by side with this figure here, you see when you look at the neck and the configuration of the head in its more simple form, you see the same thing with the neck on the figure. And so I started thinking about the importance of the actual shape as a concept, because obviously this is a stylistic rendering. If there are other renderings of animals and plants and things that are more realistic, for example, in the Badarian period. So we know that it was an art motif and an art style. So when we take that basic shape and we just take the basic shape of the neck and the head, we see a similar shape in the ma'at flower, or the ma'at feather, or as it's known, the chouette. And it's possible that we're talking about a canonization of an idea that ultimately is based in the shape or the defining trait of the ostrich as they saw it. Because when you talk about the concept of ma'at, you're talking about balance and order and things that are upright, especially morally. And when you take that motif and put it in with the neck of the ostrich, we can see that there is a similarity there when you isolate that pattern from the feather itself, because ostrich feathers don't look like that. You know, they have plumes on both sides of the feather. So this could represent a flattened like feather that's like the wind's blowing across it, because you will see them, they'll look like that when you hit them with wind. But you know, that I don't really know. It's just an idea that I had, because you know, when you look for answers, you're going to end up with more questions. So that's something that I ended up having to go through like regularly. I ended up with a lot of questions. Now this one, my caption has disappeared for some reason, but this comes out of the Rudolph Kupler's book on the Book of Caves. Thank you. Yeah, on the Cave of Beasts. And so I started thinking about shapes again, you know, and when you think about, you have over here on the left, this is the actual picture from the book itself. And on the right, I manipulated the picture and removed the bodies of the animals. And so when you do that, you ultimately get the wasp staff. And the reason why that's important is because in this time when their environment is changing, you know, there's, you know, their way of life, that you have to hold on to it, right? So when you talk about pastoral peoples, And I tend to think that the wasp staff ultimately is them representing, holding their pastoral tradition in their hands, because that's something that they can control when you're talking about the cattle herds and just the other animals that are around in these areas as this grassland and stuff is leaving. And we can see the basic shape of the wasp staff if we look at like a bovine animal. For example, you have the head, you have the neck, and then you have the thoracic limb at the front, and you even have the split hoof at the bottom. And so this is the area of the animal that's most powerful. It's where it generates all its power from, and this is also the most dangerous part of the animal, which is probably where we get not just the concept of dominion, but also the concept of power. And if you're able to hold that into your hands, you have some control of the world around you during a time, thank you, when these animals are starting to leave. And so we'll get into that in a minute. But before that, I want to deal with this composite figure, because we've been talking about them, pretty much my whole presentation. But when you look at Satek, you see he has all of this. Even when you look at him in carvings, he has a lot of detail every place on his body except for the two things that stick up from his head. And I think that there's a really good reason for that. And it's because we know his nature, he's a composite figure. But when you think about all of these other animals that he's associated with, whether it be, people always say, hey, he looks like an aardvark, or, he looks like this or he looks like that. And when you look at these other animals that he would be associated with coming from the pastoral system, they all have these protrusions on their heads, whether they're horns or whether they're ears. So when you're talking about a composite character, if it could be either the horns or the ears or other things that pop up on the head of an animal, you tend to want to leave that ambiguous, just because, ears don't necessarily look like horns, as you can see here with the addax and like the aardvark, for example. And let's see. So this figure here, I wanted to focus in on the standard and the bot figure on the standard. This particular piece comes from 34. In the median, I always like to go to the middle, 3400 BCE. So when we isolate the standard itself from the rest of the scene, you can break it down into individual pieces. And so by my estimation, it seems like we're actually looking at a rebus. So the rebus principle it represents the jump from pictographic inscriptions to actual words. So you have the bot symbol by itself with the D28 hands, and then you have the standard with the double fringe. And then when you put them together, you get the figure that's on the standard. And which is important because that double fringe is the earliest attestation of the netter symbol. And so you can spell out her name phonetically, which is the way it's usually rendered, I have at the bottom. But I think that what happened in this case is that we were trying to figure out what was on the pot. And it's possible that we missed that these standards are actually words. And this one comes from during the time that, of the tags that Gunter Dreyer found in Abju. And so the incense burner, I'm really only going to focus on this part. And this is, of course, from later. But when we look at these individual things here, there's 4 things that aren't accounted for here by the University of Chicago. You have the fish, which I allege that it's the Nile perch. You have the symbol there for men's name, because I think the consensus is that this is men. You have the seated, you have the standing figure with the phallus, and then at the end of it, you have that double fringed netcher symbol that I was talking about earlier. So if you go and break it down, it's possible that the fish is an early version of the een. Got it. Thank you. It's an early version of the een biliteral. And then you have the men symbol, and then you have the determinatives behind it. Now we can actually explain why the antelope is there, because when antelopes mate, they have to mate on the run, so to speak, because their environment's dangerous. So they have to do it really, really quickly. And so when the males are mating, what they do is sometimes they really don't need to be near the female in order to ejaculate. So we can see this actually reflected, obviously, in the concept of men, especially with them standing, because they will stand with their phalluses erect without the female being around. So this part, I'm gonna have to cut. I'm gonna have to blow through this. But the ostrich nest is the final resting place. I think that the shallow graves that we have are associated with the actual ostrich nest. And when we talk about the evolution of these grave sites, we tend to start with the actual grave site itself, then work to the purjet or the mastaba, then the stair step building, and then the more famous mere in the triangle shape. But we can see that the ostrich nest itself is very similar to the configuration of the shallow pit graves. All right. And the last thing I'm going to say real quick is that we have to remember that these are people. And so when we're studying these things, we have to keep their humanity intact. Because I would argue that if we don't keep their humanity intact and remember that they're people just like us, we're not doing scholarly things, and we're not doing morally upright things. So that's it. I'm done. All right.